It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our second CHR talk for the fall of 2018. Today, Professor James McDougall will speak to us on revolutions and counter-revolutions from anti-colonialism to the Arab Spring, Algeria, Africa, and Islam. Dr. McDougall received his PhD from Oxford University, taught at Princeton, we had a discussion about his Princeton years, and is now the professor of modern and contemporary history at Oxford University. He's an expert on the history of Algerian nationalism and the long struggle against 130 years of French colonialism, as well as the more recent impact of the Arab Spring and the influence of Arab culture in Africa. His books include A History of Algeria, which was published in 2017, and History and the Culture of Nationalism, which was published in 2009. He also recently published an article on security, sociology, and the contemporary history of Islam in the journal Annales. And Professor McDougall is also working on a very interesting project sort of linking 19th century Caribbean French colonialism with African colonialism and sort of both First and Second empires of French colonialism up through the 20th century, which I'm really looking forward to as an early Americanist. So I'd also like to thank the Department of French and Italian for co-sponsoring this talk today. And without further ado, let's welcome Professor McDougall.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks to Margaret for the invitation to come. Thanks to the Department of French and Italian and the Department of History for inviting me. Thanks to Chris Adams also for sorting out the finances and arranging flights and stuff. And thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon. I know it's raining outside, so maybe that's helps. But thank you for coming anyway. And it's a great pleasure to be here in this amazing department. It's a fantastic department of history and a great centre. And I was looking online at some of the previous talks you've had on this series, and I was a little scared, to be perfectly honest, because they've been amazing. It's been a really great series. Clearly, had some amazing people come and give talks. So I'm slightly nervous about this, partly because what I'm going to say is suggestive, really, maybe rather more than demonstrative, and it's very much a kind of this is an opportunity for me to kind of throw some thoughts together rather than to present anything in the way of finished research. I've spent the last 20 years working on Algeria, and am now, as Margaret said, working on a bigger book about the French Empire in Africa. So revolution is never very far away from my mind. Obviously, when writing about Algeria, you kind of can't get away from that. In many respects, a lot of my work on Algeria has been about things other than the revolution. In fact, the one thing that I haven't worked on really systematically in Algerian history is the War of National Independence, War of Liberation from 1954 to 62, which is the one thing that most people know about Algeria. So I've been working on other things. So this is an opportunity to think about the significance of the Algerian Revolution in longer and larger context, to think about maybe its global significance, maybe the significance of issues arising from the way that I've thought about the Algerian Revolution in a larger context. So what I'm going to give you is very much a series of slightly inchoate thoughts, so you'll have to excuse me if it's not as kind of fully worked out as some of the other papers that you've had, but let's see where we can get to. For anyone who might still want to entertain a 20th century perspective on historical progress, it seems undeniable that we're living in somewhat depressing times. There was a joke, at least I think there was a joke. I've told this anecdote so many times in lecture that I now wonder whether I made it up or whether it's really real. But if I did make it up, then it's one of those apocryphal things that actually tell the truth, so I'm still going to tell you the joke. In Tunis, in the early 2000s, about the time that the dictator Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali was received at the White House by George W. Bush, which was in February 2004, there was a joke about history moving backwards. After the 1989 revolutions in Eastern Europe, the third wave of democratization theory, there was a lot of depression in the Arab world about the way that the Middle East had been left behind. In the 1950s and 1960s, Tunisia in particular had been seen, especially by American political scientists, as the one promising poster child of modernization theory in the Arab world. But by the early 2000s, it could be said, and I think it was said, and I don't think I'm making it up, that while the rest of the Arab world was moving backwards, Tunisia was moving backwards faster than everybody else. And now many of us kind of have that sense that that's happening globally. In the US and the UK in particular, with Trump and Brexit and all they portend, and more significantly perhaps with everything that underlies them and of which they're merely symptoms, history is moving, if not exactly backwards, at least in markedly regressive directions. And the same might be said for a variety of different reasons, but in perhaps connected or analogous ways of what's happening in Turkey and Russia and the Philippines and probably in 2 days' time Brazil. And after the explosion of optimism in 2011 in the Arab world and among sympathetic observers of the Arab world, at a degree of political change that many had thought impossible, the same is true now, of course, again, about the Middle East. While some European and American governments and observers were too credulously happy, perhaps, to welcome the Arab uprisings of 2011 as a belated confirmation of the universalizing neoliberal transition theories of the 1990s, others were already determined that the so-called Arab Spring could only prove to be what one observer at the time told me was another false dawn. Those skeptics were proved right, not because they were right to begin with, not because they were right that the authoritarian personality would inevitably win out, but because the revolutionary moment in the region was hijacked by domestic counter-revolutionary forces, was swept up in sectarian geopolitics, and was stifled by the counter-revolutionary offensives launched by, ironically, both Saudi Arabia and Iran. But once the wave of democratization, so-called mood, had passed, European and American governments and commentators and businesses, of course, were generally happy to settle back down to supporting repressive dictatorships in preference to instability. Indeed, of course, the encouragement to the counter-revolutionaries was such, and their other actions were so apparently consequence-free, that the Saudis in particular seem to have thought that they could now very literally get away with very public murder. Indeed, if they're not getting away with it, it's only because their cover-up was the worst cover-up, right? It's not because of the heinous character of the killing. These forces of rollback and reaction were mightily assisted, of course, by the other great disruptive movement to come out of the new Syrian civil war after 2011, combined with the older Iraqi civil war since 2003 and the so-called war on terror that followed 9/11 2001, namely ISIS or Daesh, Islamic State in northern Iraq and Syria. It was a youthful, hopeful, liberal and emancipatory coalition of young activists, workers, lawyers, human rights defenders, feminists and ordinary people on the street demanding dignity and justice and meaningful enfranchisement within the nation-state that made the protests in Tunis and Cairo and elsewhere, and who overthrew Ben Ali and Mubarak. The eclipse of those actors on the regional stage within only 2 years by the black flags and the beheadings and the suicide bombings of the deliberately medievalizing Daesh horror show is perhaps the starkest illustration anywhere in recent history of recent history going backwards fast. Now, for historians of Asia and Africa and of Asian and African revolutionary movements, this regressive trend is certainly as depressing as it is for anyone else, but it's not exactly unfamiliar. And it raises the question, which is perhaps an obvious question, but like many obvious questions, one that's sometimes taken for granted, about the relationship that we often assume, at least in progressively rather than conservatively oriented scholarship, between revolution and historical progress. In some respects, it's impossible for us, maybe, as inheritors of an intellectual tradition that runs back to 1763 and 1789, to avoid taking a position on what became and remains a very fundamental dividing line, as Peter Fritsch's work has shown, between different conceptions of the present related to the past as being structured by the epochal divide of the 18th century Atlantic revolutions, the American, the Haitian, and the French. And if we position ourselves, as I do, on the progressive, as it were, pro-revolutionary side of that divide, against the conservative tradition that sprang from Burke in Britain, against the reaction to the revolution that animated the French Catholic monarchist right in the 19th century Party of Order, and against the containment of revolution led by Napoleon and continued by rightist Bonapartisms in Europe and racial orders in both Europe and the Americas into the second half of the 20th century, it's especially worth being clear and self-critical, perhaps, about our perhaps unexamined assumptions that revolution from that 18th century moment on can be seen, not perhaps simply, but primarily, as a driver of historical progress. Now this, of course, means taking a critical view of the earlier historiography of revolutions, written within an older Marxist teleology, in which the historical significance of actually occurring revolutions, let's go full Marxist and call them that, judged in respect of their contribution or otherwise to the advent of the revolution with a capital R, was the really important thing. The revolution with a capital R, that is, as an eschatological expectation. As an expectation of a particularly predetermined, preordained, almost religiously encoded understanding of how time was supposed to progress. Something that was embedded, of course, in official Soviet historiography and foreign policy, but also was central to some extent to the work of an older generation of Marxist historians, all the way from C.L.R. James through to Eric Hobsbawm. Without that older 20th century orthodox Marxist narrative frame, the place of revolutions as moments of upheaval on an historical timeline might still be thought of as linear, as moving forward, though not necessarily with a particularly foreordained positive sense to the change it brings about. So Martin Maley, for example, writes of revolutions as locomotives of history, as accelerating movers of change. And as we know, change can be in various directions, not necessarily forwards. But even in some of the current political science literature, revolutionary change, especially revolutionary change out of authoritarianism in the global south, is coded in sometimes surprisingly unilinear, even indeed eschatological language. We sometimes read of countries that are expected to ascend via revolutionary change, from unfreedom to liberal democracy, for example, in the work of Richard Sinclair, whose really interesting work on the correlations between demography and historical change was referred to by Jack Goldstone in his lecture here last year. So this is an almost Hegelian accession, right, from a lower state of plane, a lower kind of plane of historical existence to a higher one. Now again, we might personally agree that accession, if not ascension, toward democracy, political pluralism, greater rather than fewer civil and political rights and so on is a good thing, and I would say that that's true. But perhaps if we want to see revolutions in historical perspective, rather than in what can sometimes be the rather mechanistic terms of political science, let alone in the eschatological terms of either orthodox Marxism or liberal democratic transition theory, and the two have more in common, I think, than is often supposed, we might need to consider evolution less as a category of our own analysis through the lens of the valences and the variable social scientific definitions with which we invest them, than in terms of what historical actors themselves meant when they evoked and engaged in revolution as a category of practice. So I'm drawing a distinction between revolution as a category of analysis, kind of social scientific, this is a thing that we can observe and predict, and revolution as a category of practice, as a category of real politics in which people actually engage with a potentially limitless number of meanings. And this implies, I think, grappling more directly with the tensions within actual revolutionary processes, as the practice of real politics, in philosopher Raymond Geuss's words, between the utopian and the real dimensions of revolution, between the emancipatory opening of revolutionary moments, and the construction of new forms of domination and repression that are always produced, or that at least so far historically always have been produced within them. And in particular, in the context of the Global South, this means addressing the tension between what Sam Moyn has recently called mid-20th century anti-colonialism's emphatic nationalism and its subaltern cosmopolitanism. Subaltern cosmopolitanism being the opening to a more expansive, emancipatory sense of the world, and emphatic nationalism as being a more contained dynamic. The tension that is between liberation or self-determination as bounded and legitimised in internationalist terms by the national community and its nation-state as the actor to be enfranchised, implicitly against both national others and other nations, and a more expansive vision of global struggle against injustice, seeking to establish a more thoroughgoing reordering of international order and the global division of privilege. A sharply inegalitarian division of privilege, which the international order itself, of course, preserved through the era of decolonisation and continues to preserve today, arguably in increasingly accentuated forms, including within societies of the global north. Now, Moyn, referring to that distinction, reference I just made to Sam Moyn's distinction between emphatic nationalism and subaltern cosmopolitanism comes from his endorsement to what I think is going to be a really important book, forthcoming from Princeton by the Chicago political scientist Edom Katachu, a book called World Making After Empire, which emphasizes the political thought of the Black Atlantic in the era of decolonization, emphasizing radical thinkers like W.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, Eric Williams, Kwame Nkrumah, and others, who sought, in the words of the blurb for the book, I'm citing the blurb for the book because the book is not yet out, right? So get the book when it comes out, this is what's being said about it, who sought to remake not only nations but the world, whose thought and action in the age of mid-20th century anti-colonial struggle aimed, quotes, to transcend legal, political and economic hierarchies in order to create an egalitarian post-imperial world. This is a really important, it's going to be a really important intervention, I think, in the recent historiography of the ends of empire and what nationalism and what decolonisation, what anti-colonialism was thought to mean. But as I say, I'm quoting from the blurb because I haven't seen the book yet, so buy the book when it comes out, it's going to be good. And it's in that perspective that we might, I think, revisit the question of the significance of the Algerian Revolution as an emblematic mid-century anti-colonial struggle. in many ways a crucible of anti-colonial internationalist third worldism. And who better to help us think about that than the very obvious Frantz Fanon. Fanon, who was a brutally practical, clear-sighted analyst of the late colonial situation, and also of the challenges facing decolonisation, someone who, of course, was a committed revolutionary activist, but someone who could also be a hopelessly utopian romantic thinker. I tend to be very critical of Fanon, especially what Fanon had to say about the remaking of human subjectivity through the practice of anti-colonial violence. Fanon's analysis, in particular of the Algerian peasantry as a revolutionary force, which Algerian nationalists at the time with whom Fanon worked in Tunis pointed out to him was completely unrealistic and completely wrong. And I get into all kinds of trouble from post-colonial theorists by banging on about how Fanon got Algeria completely wrong. But there are all kinds of things that are really important about Fanon's thoughts, and we'll think about one or two of those just now. So here's Fanon at his most utopian. This is a passage from Fanon's notebook that he wrote in Mali in 1960 during his mission from Accra to open up the southern front of the Algerian Revolution through the Sahara, something which actually never really came to pass, not in any militarily significant way. Published in 1964 in the collection of essays that Masbero put out as Pour la Révolution Africaine. And Fanon here describes what it was that he and his comrades were up to in Africa, and it's an opportunity for him to express a really expansive vision of what the Algerian Revolution taken down below the Sahara would mean to the rest of Africa, and what it would mean to assemble African nationalists and African nationalism and the forces of the continent in his vision to rush back up through the Sahara into Algeria, to get Africa moving, to participate in its organization, to bring it together behind revolutionary principles, to be involved in the ordered movement of the continent. That was the work I had chosen, he says. And he describes how the aim was to bring up arms and ammunition from Bamako, to bring the Sahara's population into the revolt, to infiltrate north to the Algerian plateau after bringing Algeria to the four corners of Africa, to go up again with all of Africa, to African Algeria, to the north, to Algiers, the continent city. What I wanted was great transport lines, great navigation routes across the desert, to tame the desert, negate it, nier le désert, he says. To gather Africa together, create the continent, everyone together, climbing the slopes of the desert and storming the bastion of colonialism, to throw a continent into the assault on the last ramparts of colonial power. What Fanon called this Africa to come, cette Afrique à venir, what he called l'accouchement du monde, the bringing to birth of a new world. This is the sense of the construction of a future projected forwards by sheer force of will. A continental revolution, opening up all kinds of future emancipatory possibilities, not simply a series of interlinked national liberation struggles, but the remaking of a whole African future. Within this very utopian vision, Fanon was nonetheless very conscious of the forces ranged against it at exactly the same time. Already in the summer of 1960, when he was writing these words, as Fanon noted in the same sketch, in Congo, he says, Lumumba is struggling. Patrice Lumumba would, of course, be overthrown that September, only a couple of months later, and assassinated in January 1961. And again, in the same notebook, Fanon records his meetings with and the death of the Cameroonian revolutionary leader, Félix Moumié, the man on the left-hand side of the slide there, who was assassinated by a French intelligence agent in Geneva in November 1960. So again, 1960, not a good year, as it turned out, for African anti-colonialism. Ruben Umunyobe, the other great leader of the Cameroonian UPC, the revolutionary movement in Cameroon, third from left in the slide at the top there, had already been killed by French forces in the Maquis in southern Cameroon in September 1958. And the UPC insurgency in Cameroon, I just want to say a few words about this. The insurgency of the Union des Populations Camerounaises, the Union of Populations of Cameroon, is massively under-researched, certainly, in the literature. There are a few older books and one or two more recent things about this, but talks about, to the extent of this, talks about as a failed or defeated revolution, but really important, I think, as a moment at this particular time. The UPC, the most radical of the Cameroonian nationalist movements, founded in 1948, was banned in 1955, launched an insurrection in 1956, spread through 1959, and in the case of Cameroon, national independence, accorded by the French on the 1st of January 1960, served above all as a vehicle for continued neo-colonial influence, as is well known. And France is kind of anointed, as it were, President Ahmadou who's also on the slide there. And the war against the UPC insurrection continued, of course, under official Cameroonian command after January 1961, but with operational French troops still in the field until 1962. And the French military mission remained in place to combat the ongoing insurrection until December 1964. And the insurrection limped on right up until the execution by firing squad of Ernest Wendier, who was the last of the UPC guerrilla leaders, in January 1971, so fully 11 years after independence. And this is a neglected story relative to that of Algeria, but as I hope I'll show, it's directly connected. And maybe more important, in fact, as a model for what actually happens in Africa. So the forces of reaction ranged against the historical progress of the revolution in the global south as expressed by Fanon, as we might conventionally expect, and as Fanon indeed wrote at the time, were, as very visibly in Cameroon, those of domestic reaction, if you like, to use again the terms of the time, vested interests, and their outside imperialist backers. And of course there's plenty of evidence for the persistence of that very obvious kind of counter-revolution in the Middle East and Africa in the past 60 years. The forces which are routinely blamed in nationalist historiography for the failures of the various anti-colonial revolutionary movements of the global south. In Cameroon, very clearly, a more radical revolutionary movement, the UPC, was defeated in the context of what was effectively a civil war, either side of national independence, by another group within the emerging national political class. National independence within the framework of close military security as well as economic and political cooperation with the former imperial power served here as a vehicle for the construction of post-independence authoritarianism and the frustration of those more radical transnational visions of decolonisation. But did the imbrication of even this most radical transcontinental anti-colonialism, as expressed by Fanon, within movements that were, after all, in the first instance, on the ground and as a matter of real practical politics, first of all, anti-colonial nationalist movements, did that also portend the foreclosure of its more radical emancipatory possibilities? Arguably, this is the case for Cameroon, for the simple reason that Mnyobe in particular had always insisted above all on the UPC as a Cameroonian nationalist movement, not a Pan-Africanist or transnational movement, and especially not the vehicle for international communism that it was accused of being by the French. And indeed, one argument about the UPC and the failure of the UPC insurrection is that the lack of a broader Pan-Africanist vision may have contributed to the insurgency's lack of outside backing and broader appeal. Neither Mnyobe nor even Mounier, who was more radical, was able to develop the continental stature of someone like Nkrumah or the Algerian iconic leader Ben Bella. And this brings us to the more uncomfortable but necessary question of how and why revolutionary movements, at the same time as they might be more conventionally seen as facing counter-revolution from outside enemies, from imperialism and its lackeys, again to use the language of the time, the extent to which they've sometimes also carried counter-revolution within themselves. Not simply as forces of reaction of an ancien regime, but as new repressive dynamics or new self-containing dynamics emerging within the dynamism of the revolutionary situation itself. Here we come to the way we think about Algeria. Algeria as an iconic, transnational, international revolutionary beacon of third worldist liberatory hope, and Algeria as often misunderstood, I think, in those terms. What does the arc of revolutionary and post-revolutionary Algerian history actually look like? What does it really tell us? Well, first of all, Algeria's national liberation movement, Front Libération Nationale, the Algerian National Liberation Front, was above all a nationalist liberation movement. It was about territory, its internal politics were organised by the logic of an insurrection which was locally organised in the particular territorial divisions of Algeria itself. Its politics defined by internally conflictual social and political relations between different elements of the movement, between different constituencies, different factional loyalties in particular formed around the particular, usually autonomously operating guerrilla groups within the different wilayas, the different regions into which Algeria was divided, and which already give a good indication of the way in which the FLN thought about both political geography, territoriality, territorial nationalism, and the internal structuring of the movement itself. However extraordinary the resonance on the international stage of the Algerian Revolution after independence in 1962. The way in which Algeria was seen by Cuba, by other revolutionary movements, especially in Africa, as the Mecca of revolution, to use the title of Jeff Burns' recent book. It's worth asking ourselves to what extent this was really a central part of what the Algerian Revolution was really all about. The extent to which Ahmed Ben Bella, the Algerian first president in 1962, seen here with Che Guevara in 1963, was seen on the international stage as an exponent of that more expansive transnational liberatory movement that Fanon expressed, could never compete internally with the dynamics of factional politics emerging from within the history of the FLN during the war itself, and led, of course, to Ben Bella's overthrow in June 1965 by his Minister of Defense, Bory Boumediene, who succeeded him at the head of the state. Boumediene's coup in June 1965 was presented, of course, as a revolutionary correctional movement, a mouvement de redressement, but seen by its opponents within, on the left of the FLN, as a putsch by what they called the armed wing of the petty bourgeoisie, as a rightist seizure of power by the army against the still developing revolutionary enthusiasm of mass popular mobilization, which was associated with the presidency of Ben Bella. And that was an argument about the internal dynamics of the revolution, an argument about the leadership of the revolution was articulated by a small group of leftists within the FLN who constituted themselves as a movement of resistance, the Organization of Popular Resistance, the ORP, against Boumediene, an organization that lasted about 6 months before it was infiltrated by the political police, shut down, all its members basically put in prison and tortured, and then put into house arrest for the next decade. But of course, that wasn't something that suddenly came out of nowhere in 1965 with the coup by Boumediene. There had already been internal repression under Ben Bella. Algiers under Ben Bella was perhaps a third world capital, but it was also the capital of an emerging police state. There had already been a revolt in Kabylia, in this area, east of Algiers, in 1963 to 1965, put down by Ben Bella's army under Boumediene. There had already been the arrest and the torture of opponents before 1965, something which would continue unabated after 1965 and indeed continues to happen up to the present. So the entrenchment of real power, of real politics in factions and in the army behind the party, which was reduced to a facade, the repression of opponents, especially the Algerian Communist Party, which went underground right after independence, immediately banned in 1962 at independence and remained clandestine until 1989, was a fundamental part of what made the revolution and of what the revolution made. The Algerian Revolution was constraining as well as liberating. Who defined the revolution and how? Who defined liberation and how? Who defined nationalism and how? I'm not going to go into any more detail about that. I wrote a whole book about this, and then nobody read that book, so I wrote another one, which also bangs on about it in the same ways. And sometimes I get criticised very reasonably for being very critical of Algerian nationalism, which is an indication, I think, of the extent to which this particular part of the field is still dominated by political positions that people might want to take or people might want to have taken relative to the struggles of this moment, right, which is entirely understandable. If you want to be on the side of the good guys, right, then you're on the side of the FLN, not on the side of the French. So Algerian nationalism is almost still a cause with which one has to identify. And I want to make clear that I think Algerian nationalism was absolutely essential and historically justified as a movement of national liberation. But if you want to understand how it worked, and what allowed it to be made, as well as the ways in which it might be seen to have set up a dynamic of repression and of containment, and understand the state that it created that continued to exist in Algeria for the subsequent decades, then we need to understand these internal dynamics without being afraid to address them in their complexity. Fanon, after all, to be perfectly frank, and as Ernest Gellner said in the 1980s, was for export. A more socially, morally conservative nationalism was infinitely more important in mobilizing support for the revolution among and in entrenching it after independence. Ben Bella might have been seen on the world stage as an African Castro, as an African Mao, as part of this early 1960s transnational revolutionary left. But Ben Bella was also an advocate of a very romantically conceived Arabo-Islamic nationalism. Sometimes surprising to Western observers when Ben Bella, after a long time in house arrest and a long time in exile in Switzerland, attempted to return to the political scene in Algeria in the late 1990s with a movement called the political party called the Movement for Democracy in Algeria, which was kind of Islamist, kind of aligned very much on the right of Algerian politics. And everybody was like, wow, isn't this the guy who used to go under the Mao shirt in the 60s and was, kind of super leftist and revolutionary and secular? And actually, no. It was Ben Bella in 1962, during the work that was being carried on for the constitutional planning for the Tripoli program in 1962, who vetoed the idea that Algeria should be a secular state, who insisted that Islam would be the religion of state, and that Islam and the Arabic language would be central to what defined the national community. Boumediene, who succeeded him, tamed but also accommodated conservative religious opinion. Under Boumediene, certainly there was no sense that the revolution could be appropriated by conservative religious opinion, but narratives of the revolution as having been a war for Islam did begin to develop under Boumediene's regime in the 1970s. A conservative cultural revolution from 1971 accompanied and counterbalanced the more leftist agrarian revolution, which was unpopular with religious leaders, which had been launched at the same time. And this was clearly a very deliberate part of Boumediene's own strategy, right? That you would launch an agrarian revolution, you would take a left turn at the same time as they were nationalizing all resources, kicking out the last remnants of neocolonial French influence, taking steps that were seen as being relatively secularizing, relatively leftists, attack on private property, which the conservative Islamic scholars, the ulama, did not like. At the same time, Boumediene was kind of outsourcing management of the cultural and educational fields to some of those same currents of opinion, effectively to placate them, something which, after his death in 1978, would have very serious repercussions in Algerian culture and politics in the 1980s. And in doing that, the Boumediene regime and the people within the Boumediene regime on the right who began to invest in these kinds of arguments and who very much invested themselves in the positions of power in the regime in the Ministry of Religious Affairs, the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Education, were building on the early role of Islam in defining and articulating ideas about history and the proper future of an Algerian national community, which had been developing since the 1920s. These were constraining, prescriptive and proscriptive, as well as mobilizing, empowering and enabling ideas. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail, we'll have a book about this, so History and the Culture of Nationalism 2006 is the book for you to read if you want to know more about that. So we need, I think, to take seriously, without being anti-nationalist, the prescriptions and proscriptions, the tendency of nationalist anti-colonialism to generate new relations of domination, new terms of exclusion and proscription, in the very process by which it overturned old forms of exclusion and domination. And the way that it did so in large part through the ways that it creatively adopted and repurposed colonial forms of knowledge and power, especially ones about Arab and Islamic history and colonialist historical narratives of civilization and progress. And from this perspective, a very different kind of revolution, often seen within the Middle East and North Africa as the antithesis of Algeria's revolution, maybe doesn't look so different after all. And that, of course, is the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. In this respect, the Iranian Revolution maybe isn't as novel as Hobsbawm or Michel Foucault thought. For Hobsbawm, the Iranian Revolution was the first major social revolution to break with the revolutionary tradition of 1789 and 1917. For revolutionaries of the old kind, Hobsbawm wrote, the emergence of Khomeini as the leader of revolution against the Shah was, quotes, as bizarre a development as if Pope Pius IX had taken a lead in the Roman Revolution of 1848. So Khomeini, to leftist observers in the 1970s and 80s, was a perplexing embodiment of both revolution and counter-revolution, a spokesman of what some, like Foucault, saw as a newly authentic emancipatory movement from the global south, escaping from the dominant Western forms of knowledge and traditions of revolution embodied in 1789 and 1917, who at the same time denounced indiscriminately what Khomeini called the imperialism of the left and the imperialism of the right, the oppressive military power of the United States, and what Khomeini called the satanic cunning of the Soviet Union. But in fact, there's less new here than met the mid-20th century eye. If the political theory with which and the institutions within which Shia Islam was put to work in revolutionary Iran were indeed very novel, as we know, Islam more broadly, after all, had itself repeatedly been a revolutionary force in world historical terms, an old idea from the 7th century, as well as a new one for the 20th century. So it's perhaps necessary to reconsider also the significance of what seemed like the novel, surprising eruption of Islam as a political force into a world of conflict that was defined for most observers in the 1970s by the Cold War, by a global conflict defined entirely in terms of the global north and its divisions between West and East. Islam, in this period, was no pre-modern throwback, making an anomalous re-entry onto the world historical scene, odd as Khomeini's dress may have appeared to observers of him in Paris or in Najaf or in Tehran in 1979 might have seemed. It was only Western perceptions, too blinkered by modernization theories on both left and right, and the secularization thesis that made it look like one. Ever since the constitutional revolutions of Iran in 1905 and Turkey in 1908, the Caliphate movement in India in 1919, and the emergence of both secularist and religiously inflected Arab nationalisms in the 1920s, Islam, after all, had been an active ingredient in the dynamics of revolutionary political practice across Muslim-majority societies. And it served in Iran, as it has earlier in Algeria, and as it would later in Afghanistan, as both an idiom of national identity, a proper prescriptive and proscriptive belonging to a national community, empowering a real politics of action on the ground, and as a language for articulating a social, political, moral vision transcending the national community and the nation-state in a utopian and sometimes, yes, exactly, eschatological conception of what revolutionary action might mean. So the anti-Soviet war of the Afghan Mujahideen in the 1980s was internally a revolutionary war of national resistance against foreign occupation, and at the same time, a counter-revolution against Afghanistan's own socialist government and its domestic agenda, as well as being a regional front for the West, which here, ironically but logically, means the US and Pakistan, in the global Cold War against the USSR, and an inspirational struggle in global terms for Muslims across the world. And to move very quickly on, one place in which this inspiration was felt, and where again, in this respect, it shouldn't have been as surprising as it was to many people, was back in Algeria in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So this is a photo by a Swiss photographer, Michael van Grafenried, who in the mid-1990s was frequently going to Algeria, was kind of embedded, in fact, in slightly interesting ways with Algerian security forces. This is a photo of a rally by the Algerian Islamic Salvation Front in December 1991 in central Algiers. Political Islam in Algeria, which again took many observers by surprise. Hang on, wasn't Algeria this kind of francophone, secular, leftist, Fanon, Ben Bella in his mouse shirt, all that kind of stuff? Where did these guys come from? Political Islam in Algeria was an inheritance of the revolution, as well as a backlash against the revolution 2 decades on, by the late 1980s. The Islamic dimension of Algeria's own nationalism was expanded and reimagined in a context of global Islamic revival and in the context of the decay of the authoritarian nationalist regimes in the territorial nation-states inherited at independence. The FIS, the FIS, the Islamic Salvation Front, was the antithesis, a movement of response to and rejection of what was seen as the corrupt, vacuous, decaying FLN, but it was also, as its acronym very deliberately articulated, the FIS, the son of the FLN. And the idea that le fils c'est le fils du FLN was a slogan very deliberately cultivated in Algeria at the time. The idea that the genuine inheritance of the revolution as a war for God, as an emancipatory struggle for the creation of a truly morally pure Algerian community of Muslims had been betrayed by the people who had confiscated power at independence, was a very powerful one to a generation of Algerians born largely after independence and coming to political adulthood in this moment. But it wasn't simply an idea, as many people will try to tell you, imported from the Middle East and stuck onto an Algerian population who didn't know what they were doing. It was very much a movement that also came from within the dynamics of Algeria's own nationalist revolutionary traditions. The results of that clash between different interpretations of the Algerian Revolution, in particular different appropriations of the Algerian Revolution, are, as we know, what happened in Algeria in the 1990s. The violence of 10 years of insurgency and counterinsurgency, a dirty war waged by the state, and a vicious terrorist campaign waged by Islamist militia. An insurgency which was imagined initially in the early 1990s very much as a replay of the War of National Liberation, as a new reiteration of what the FLN had always truly been about, against the inheritors not of the wartime FLN, but against Hizb Frantz, against the party of France, against the people seen as being in power, seen as being kept in power by their relations to a kind of neo-colonial centre of power within the Algerian state, placed there in 1958 by de Gaulle to keep the Algerians down, to steal the revolution from the people and from Islam. At the same time, it was a struggle seen by the generals who took power in 1992 and fought the war against the Islamists as a defence of the revolution against what they thought of as retrograde obscurantism. The coup d'etat in 1992, Frantz, President Chedli Ben Jadid, and started the war, was later justified by Khaled Nazar, Minister of Defence at the time, and the other people around him as what they called a Novemberist movement, a movement in continuity with the historical revolution of the 1st November 1954, with the genuine inheritance of the FLN. Arguably, by the 1990s, there was little left of the revolution in Algeria except this kind of hollow rhetoric, mobilised by each side against the other. And in the violence of the 1990s, arguably, what was really happening was a struggle, not, in fact, of the defence of the revolution against retrogression, as the army generals claimed, nor of the true inheritance of the revolution against its illegitimate confiscation, as the Islamists like to claim, but a struggle of one trend of counter-revolution that had been carried within the revolution against another. The counter-revolution of the corrupt, clientelist military security state against the counter-revolution of the prescriptive, proscriptive, socially conservative and reactionary dimension of Algerian populist nationalism, both of which had their origins within the politics of revolutionary anti-colonialism, both of which had been carried into the polity and into the political community of independence through the unfolding of the revolutionary struggle, and each of which had been struggling ever since national independence for preeminence against the other. And not only in Algeria, but across the Arab world, it's remarkable how the languages of anti-colonial nationalism, of national self-assertion and self-determination, have proved both durable as aspirational vectors of revolutionary emancipatory hope, and open for reappropriation, or durable again as prescriptive, proscriptive, counter-revolutionary constraints upon it. To return to where we began, and think about the Arab Spring, think about Egypt in January 2011. It was remarkable the extent to which nationalism, both territorially bounded Egyptian, Tunisian, Bahraini, and other nationalisms, and a sense of shared fraternal Arab nationalism across those territorial borders was appropriated, was used, was put to work in really creative and extraordinary ways by crowds of people in Tahrir Square in Tunis and elsewhere. It's an amazing reappearance of both territorial and trans-regional Arab nationalism, certainly, once again, to observers of the region who had thought Arab nationalism was something that had died in 1967. The appropriation, of course, of global communications, technology, and means of expression for universalizing rights-based aspirational claims was part of this story. The Facebook revolution, so here you have a protester in Tahrir Square with a sign saying Facebook, ala kul zalim, that's Facebook against every injustice, against every oppressor, against every tyrant. And an end to the era of fear. Right? Alongside a specifically national and nationalist register of popular self-assertion. The predominance in demonstrations of the national flags. We saw this in Bahrain, saw this in Tunis, saw this also in Egypt and also in Syria. That people were claiming their citizenship within the nation state, claiming enfranchisement within the nation state, as well as articulating that through a larger transnational claim to globally legitimate human civil citizenship and rights. And it's remarkable to notice the extent to which that nationalist register was also open to reappropriation by the domestic forces of counter-revolution, who redeployed them, particularly in the Egyptian case, with very great efficiency. So here we have Abdel Fattah Sisi on the left-hand side of the picture, next to Gamal Abdel Nasser, the great icon of Arab nationalism of the 1950s and 60s. This is a placard carried by police officers in a march supporting Sisi in July 2013, after Sisi had taken power. Here again, Sisi and Nasser imagined as dreaming of the greatness of the nation together. And this is an image that was circulated a lot in around 2015 to again legitimize the association of Sisi with Nasser, the idea that Sisi is a new Nasser, showing allegedly a young Sisi aged 6 or thereabouts in 1960 meeting President Nasser. This was all over social media in Egypt in the summer of 2015. And again, was the role of Islam in all this? Sisi has acted, of course, against the Islamism of Muslim Brothers, but certainly not against Islam. Right? He's supported by other very rigorous conservative Islamist groups, notably the Da'wah Salafiyya, the Salafi purist movement and its political incarnation, the Noor Party. There's been a vicious crackdown in Sisi's Egypt against LGBT groups, among others, justified by a need to reassert public morality, right, very much along kind of Islamist lines. So to conclude, before everyone gets even more depressed than you probably already are, the risk, of course, here is that we begin to see revolutionary politics and national self-determination as inevitable failures. As Arslan Barachi, a Turkish journalist and commentator on the Algerian revolution, as early as 1965, wrote a history of Algeria, a revolution that failed. And now we have a particular danger in that respect in the context of arguments for kind of rehabilitation in Britain in particular, but also in France, of imperialism, right? Of the idea that national self-determination was always a bad idea, and all these failed nation-states in the global south really ought to be recolonized. The idea that failed nation-states in the global south would benefit from a revival of imperial government, as the popular British historian Lawrence James recently wrote in Standpoint magazine, in a letter which was published with the heading The Virtues of Imperialism. And I don't want to go down that road at all. I'm very much on record as being opposed to that line of argument. But we do, I think, need to think about revolution as a historical dynamic, as turbulence, as forces in movement, as internally conflictual, rather than as a force pushing in a single progressive direction. We need to think about revolution perhaps as a recurrent part of the system of modern political and social history, as part of and as making and as made by real politics, not as a mechanism for epochal transition or transcendence. It's also a historical legacy available for reappropriation, which can be repressive as well as emancipatory, but not simply cyclical or closed. It's, in other words, a potential. It's always the promise of an open horizon. To go back to where we started, again, we are perhaps now back in a moment when the anti-colonial moment is more relevant than ever to our own politics, with the need to decolonize social relations of power not only between the global north and the global south, but within the post-imperial societies of the global north, as well as in global international relations, against the threats we face today of what I've called near-fascism and of authoritarian kleptocracy. There might still be something to be gained from reconsidering the history of what, in Raymond Williams's words, we might call a long revolution in the 20th century. Not a single unidirectional ascent, to be sure, but a series of complex struggles. A century of disruptive revolutionary moments or episodes, each of which carried within itself and was often unable to prevent its own foreclosure through its own counter-revolutionary internal contradictions, but each of which struggled nonetheless and was sometimes able to open a horizon on the future. And that's probably what we still need now.
Well, I'll let Jim take questions from the audience, if any of you have any questions.
Probably if we just announced to kind of flee.
I Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for the talk. I'm very fascinated by some of these ideas, and I'm thinking through some of them as well. I'm coming from a perspective where I'm dealing with this issue of transnational nationalism. So Jeff Burton's book is kind of my touchstone for dealing with this. But I mean, I agree with you that there is this kind of subtext of Islam, and this subtext of, I think, cultural conservatism that's more deeply entwined in nationalism during this period in Africa and Asia, also to a certain extent in Latin America. But I'm wondering, just kind of throwing this out there as an idea, I'm wondering why there is this belief that Mandela, for instance, was this more kind of transnational revolutionary figure in the idea of Castro. If he's attached to this, was this just an issue of the world kind of not knowing about Algeria, and so we kind of attached to them this idea of secular revolutionaries, or is there a different emphasis, a different creation of institutions, a different involvement of certain political factions within the country that allows that makes them more revolutionary, more secular, more on that kind of side of the ledger than on the Islamist or conservative or otherwise side?
Okay. Should we collect a few questions, or should I just?
I would just take one at a
Okay,
time.
great, thank you. Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, why do people not? I mean, partly it's to do with you see what you want to see, right? And if you're a journalist observing Algeria in 1962, again, given what else is going on in the world, you see a particular event, and it's encoded in particular ways, and it presents itself in particular ways. So partly it's the difference between the very effective international face that the Algerian Revolution was able to project to the outside world, the very effective lobbying of the UN, these francophone cadres who talk a kind of socialist language, but are also very much presenting themselves in terms of non-alignment, and it's a narrative, right? So the narrative is relatively straightforward and is very receivable in that way. And Ben Bella loved being the face of the revolution, right? So. And Ben Bella, spoke mainly in French, so the way it was relatively easy to pick him up for a foreign audience. But that's precisely part of the extent to which he wasn't transmitting what was really going on in Algeria. Again, Ben Bella had been out of the country since the beginning of the revolution, right? And in prison in France from 1956 onwards. So really, the Ben Bella who became the face of the revolution for outside consumption was precisely that. And the fact that he was unable to do anything about his unseating, or that he was in fact such a fragile position that he wasn't seated in 65, tells us a lot about the extent to which he was disconnected, in fact, from the internal more complex realities of what was going on. So the face that he presented to the outside world was the one that was convenient, I guess, to present, and also that made sense to people. And he was also very vocal about his Arabism, and that was something that was clearly visible to other people. But the extent to which Ben Bella was kind of always animated by a kind of romantic, popular, Islamic dimension of nationalism was just not something that was visible to people, and not something that he talked about when he talked to Castro.
So it's kind of like a three-part question, sorry.
Okay.
Does rethinking revolution as turbulence mean rethinking the way we frame, contextualize, and understand the cornerstone revolutions that came before that we always talk about?
Right.
So should we see them not as moving us to a new linear epoch, I think you said, but as a sort of constellation of struggle? And then through that, how do we then account for the movement of transnational revolutionary ideas, if not through like a new era of revolution?
Right.
I'm just, sorry.
No, that's good. That was 2 parts, I think.
Oh, two, well, yeah.
Okay, that's fine if that's all. Okay, good. That's a good question, and I'm not sure. So as I said, these are kind of very inchoate thoughts about how to think about this stuff, rather than a fully worked out argument. And as you'll have noticed, I don't know. I mean, I started off by saying, we tend to position ourselves, I think, as historians, especially if we're on the left, as as inheriting the same kind of historical consciousness, and we also can't escape the circumstances of our own intellectual worlding, right? And so Hobsbawm's old argument about 1789 and 1917 is in some ways inescapable, right? So it's really hard work to think ourselves outside of that framework, and to think about those revolutions in different perspectives. I mean, people have done that to a certain extent, in particular looking at Haiti, right? So all the work that's been done on the Haitian Revolution, the way that the French Revolution looks a bit different if you look at it from Saint-Domingue, right? Is really important, I think, in going some way towards rethinking those kind of cornerstone revolutions, if you like, in that way. And yeah, I mean that's not my period, and it's not what I do, right? So I don't really want to say, but I mean certainly, and again, and also the work on the Russian Revolution, right? So Steve Smith's recent book on the Russian Revolution, or revolutions, like Russia in revolution, the idea of the revolution as an imperial process, as a very contested series of internal struggles in imperial borderlands between an imperial core state and its peripheries, right? And the way in which that plays out in local social relations and local ethnic relations. That's also a good example, I think, of a way of rethinking even something as kind of fundamental to our mental furniture as 1917, in a way that problematizes the way that we see it and what it might be taken to mean. So yes, I think turbulence is maybe a very imperfect analogy, but the idea that yes, that we need to be thinking less in terms of linearity, and certainly not in terms of ascent. I'm kind of trying to go with this kind of there's often a kind of implied teleology, an implied kind of eschatology, right? Even when we're trying not to think in those terms, it's often slightly implicit, I think. And getting away from that, I think, is important. And the movement of transnational ideas, yes. So obviously that saying that is not the same as saying that those narratives aren't themselves, of course, important in making in creating the conditions of possibility for new revolutionary action. So somebody like Félix Moumier or even Ben Bella, and certainly a lot of the revolutionaries in the Francophone world in the 1940s and 50s and 60s are thinking in terms of a particular narrative of 1789 and a particular narrative of 1917. So we might need, from a scholarly historical perspective, to kind of rethink those things in more critical ways, but we do need to, again, in an almost historically ethnographic way, take account of the force of those ideas as precisely kind of cornerstones or touchstones for the ways in which people formulated their own sense of themselves as historical actors and their own and the possibilities that they had, and that's really crucial. So yes, I mean the transnational nationalism, the transnational movement of revolutionary ideas, and the narrativization, like the mise en intrigue, if you like, right, the emplotment of revolution as a certain kind of narrative, as a structuring way of thinking about historical action in the world, is really, really crucial in this period and for the whole of the global South, for sure. I mean, Michael Goebbels' book on anti-imperial metropolis, right, on students in Paris, is kind of about that's what's going on in those kind of milieu, right? People are picking this stuff up and running with it in different ways. Jane?
Thank you very much for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I think it's interesting, both in the Middle Eastern context and the African context, to see how the original revolutionaries against the colonial powers are sort of sacrosanct. You look back to them for legitimacy, it's sort of blasphemous or sacrilegious to go against them and so on. At this point, for the most part, they're sort of dying out, or in the case of Mugabe, being fossilized, as it were. And so you see this attempt that you showed in those astonishing pictures from Egypt to kind of reappropriate them, kind of like it not to be flip, but it kind of reminds me of Natalie Cole singing a duet with Nat King Cole, airbrush master into the photo.
Yeah.
Is that particularly widespread? I can't think of another instance where this kind of sort of appropriation of images for legitimacy from the post-World War II anti-colonialist period has taken place. I think in Iran, occasionally there's a picture of Mossadegh that pops up that's considered extremely subversive. In India, with Nehru.
Yeah, so what they said. But so yeah, I mean, I do think, I mean, the Egyptian case is very particular. I mean, I do think that, I mean, that is right, because this is very striking. I mean, this one was hilarious. I mean, this elicited an enormous amount of comment, right, on social media and so on.
And I can't resist adding, in terms of that picture from 1960, there's one from a year or two later of President Kennedy and Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton's just older, but it's the exact same interaction.
Oh, wow, okay.
Clinton looks boyish and enthused. He's 17, and he's gazing up adoringly at President Kennedy.
Right.
And this reassured traditional Democrats that he would be democratic enough. So, one interesting question is, what does it mean in today's 21st century Middle East if you have an image of the founder and you? In other words, who are you appealing to now with that image?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I mean, it's partly an indication of, I mean, Sisi's own lack of independent credentials, right? And also an erasure of the previous association of him with the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, when Sisi was appointed head of the army, he was seen as the Brotherhood's guy. He was seen as he had been quite close to them relatively recently. So this is a way of erasing that partly. And also, I mean, to go back to Jane's question, I mean, this is an indication of the continued. I mean, maybe the. I mean, it's difficult, and I haven't been in Egypt for the last several years, so I don't know how. I mean, I don't know how effective. I mean, I think in 2013 this was being pretty effective. It's certainly very ubiquitous, but I don't know how. How popularly effective it is, how much it gives rise to a great deal of derision and sarcasm and the usual things one would expect, and how much it's actually kind of bought into. I mean, I think it is bought into by some constituencies. I mean, maybe generationally and class and regionally that also presumably varies. But I mean, so first of all, it's an indication of the very particular Egyptian case, right, where Nasser is still, Nasser is still Nasser, right? Up from Nasser, sorry, it's still up from Nasser. And although interestingly, more recently in Egypt there were other kind of foci of nostalgia. I mean, weirdly, I was in Egypt in 2010, and the really striking thing about things like the decor of public space and stuff was how much nostalgia there was for the pre-revolutionary period, how much nostalgia in Egyptian kind of public space and Egyptian culture there was for the monarchy. Right? You see there were a lot of monarchical flags and stuff around a lot, and the Nasser period was, I mean, generally under Mubarak, there was a kind of move away, right, from that as a source of legitimacy, and bringing Nasser back again as a way of a kind of pendulum swing motion maybe. It's an indication of the vacuity of the absence, the lack of alternatives, right? And sorry, to go back to what Jane was asking about, where else does this happen? I mean, it's notable how hard it's been to invent new languages of legitimacy. I mean, everywhere in the Arab world, right? I mean, one way or another. Certainly, Algeria is very striking. The way that the political class has not been able to figure out a way of moving beyond the revolutionary generation. That's why they need to keep Bouteflika on life support and in the presidency. Because even though Bouteflika himself was on record as saying, the time of my generation has passed and it's necessary to retire from the stage and to pass on. I mean, he had no idea of how to do that. Nobody around him has any desire to do it, quite obviously. So certainly in the bit of the world that I know best, that seems to be this kind of fossilization is really striking and problematic.
Yeah, related to what you were saying earlier, from my own experience and also from what you brought up, the essence of Algerian nationalism is still caught up in the idea of the revolution as a communal experience that everybody's either themselves, their parents, their grandparents as part of the shared story from transitioning from French repression to their liberation, and that is the reason why people are still so caught up in the idea of nationalism to this day. As what you were saying, the revolutionary generation dies out. Do you think there's any hope for the Algerian state to even sustain itself? Once people don't have any attachment to these ideas to even bring parties and political thought together?
So I think we need to ask ourselves what else people have attachment to, or what, how do people use nationalism to express different kinds of attachment, right? So it's really striking in the case of Algeria that one of the things that the revolution also produces, which is more kind of enabling, is a very, very powerful political culture of engaged citizenship, mobilization, demands on the state, right? I mean, Algeria is very, very dysfunctional in lots of ways, but one of the ways that Algerian political economy works really effectively is that there's a very strongly developed sense of entitlement as citizens vis-a-vis the state. And that doesn't mean that the state is necessarily responsive to citizens in a kind of law-bound, way that guarantees rights and entitlements and so on, because it isn't at all. But there are ways of mobilizing collectively for action on basic day-to-day needs and demands that might consist of going out in the street and throwing up a barricade and burning a few cars and waiting for someone from the local government to come down and negotiate with you. But someone from the local government will come down and negotiate. And there's a kind of understood sense of kind of what the rules of the game are and how society interacts with the state. It's actually, totally informal, totally outside of the political party system, totally outside of the kind of formal structures of the state, but very effective actually, which is one of the reasons that in 2011 Algeria didn't have what happened elsewhere. Algeria had lots and lots and lots of very local, almost weekly, daily sit-ins, riots, protests, right? But they never coalesced into a national movement, partly because that's not what people wanted. People weren't interested in that. People were interested in negotiating face-to-face with the state about their particular local problems, and that's very effective. And the government knows that, and as long as the rents from hydrocarbons are sufficiently large for them to deal with the management of those social situations in that kind of piecemeal ad hoc way by distributing, rents, it's actually quite an efficient way of running things. But the question really is, as you say, what happens after that? Right? They can't carry on doing that forever. I think the real test will come less when the revolution generation passes away and there's a question of how do you create a new national narrative, or how do you, how do new generations inhabit that narrative, which is going to be distanced from them in new ways, generationally, than the more basic question about, how will the state cope with the lack of resources to carry on managing things the way they always do. I think the socialization mechanisms in Algeria are really quite strong in terms of the ways that people move into that kind of culture of kind of, mouvement citoyen, right, so kind of citizenship movements. The narrative itself is maybe a different story, right? So the extent to which everybody is, it's inescapable, right? And as in many post-revolutionary states, it's inescapable to the extent that it becomes a kind of unbearable enclosure, right? And that's partly what Islamism was about, right? About taking a bit of that narrative and repurposing it, creating something else. And the bigger challenge that Algerian civil society faces, I guess, is is how to generate new, more plural narratives about what the war actually meant, right? rather than bits of the national narrative. The contribution of Saada to the revolutionary struggle in Wilaya or whatever, and more meaningful narratives about what it means to be part of the Algerian nation now, rather than what it means to be part of the Algerian revolution that was constituted there.
So I guess my question is, I think there's a sort of tendency to, particularly in 21st century politics and even historiography, to conceptualize Islam as a sort of conservative cultural and historical force. But to what extent was it sort of a motive historical force that animated revolutionary struggle? I think you kind of hit on that.
Yeah.
And my related question to that is, to what extent is this construction of Islam as a conservative production, a production of Cold War and post-Cold War politics?
Right.
Because it sort of obscures Islam and other cultural productions, ideological dynamism vis-a-vis liberalism in particular?
Yeah. Yes, that's a great question. So the way in which Islam has sometimes functioned in some of these movements has been as a kind of force of conservative, moral, profiteering, middle class, male, elite kind of concerns, right? Because of people who've articulated it in the way in which that's happened. But that doesn't exhaust the possibilities of Islam, very obviously, right? And very obviously, yes, Islam has also been a larger, more capacious cultural code and set of resources which people have put together very creatively to imagine other kinds of futures. So, I showed a slide of Khomeini, but the other person behind him, of course, is Shariati, who looks different, thinks different, is much closer to Fanon ideologically in all kinds of ways, not just because he was in Paris and read Fanon, was enormously influenced by him. So, that within, say, the Iranian Revolution, let alone within the Algerian Revolution, there were lots of different ways in which Islam is functioning. In Algeria, it's much more important as a code of communal solidarity, right? In a fundamentally rural peasant society where there is a set of moral prescriptions and expectations of community solidarity and belonging against the outsider, against the other. Which is also extremely repressive, right, for things like the way that women were treated in the Maki, or the extent to which women were able to participate in the revolutionary struggle, ways in which that was allowed and not allowed in different places. And in other contexts, it's worked quite differently, right? And I think you're right that the way that, again, just as we can't escape, our kind of mental furniture is shaped in particular ways, and we also kind of inherit the effects of those narratives even when we try to take them apart. So the ways in which the Cold War shaped particular kinds of expectations, and also the way that dominant narratives on the left shaped the role of religion relative to politics, had very profoundly structuring consequences, not only on the books that were written then about this kind of thing, but the ways in which it's possible to think about them, and not only kind of East versus West Cold War narratives, but the whole architecture of kind of Western social scientific thinking about secularization, modernity, the role that religion is supposed to not play in political life, and under conditions of modernity, and the idea that if you have religion playing a particular role in public life, then you don't have modernity somehow. That's a problem. All the way up to Samuel Huntington and all that kind of nonsense. So yes, and I think in work on intellectual history, we're now getting beyond a lot of that stuff. Some of the recent work that's been done on, say, the Nahda, right, in the Middle East, and some of the work that's been done on Muslim intellectual thought in South Asia and elsewhere, is looking much more critically at the intersections of Islamic thought articulated in specifically Islamic idioms with, say, liberalism, with ideas about responsible government, with separation of powers, right back to Ali Abdul Razak and Islam wa Suri Hukum and things like that. I think there's a lot of work now being done that is escaping from those kind of constraints.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. I was wondering, when you talk about this sort of dynamic between the kind of cosmopolitan revolutionary ideology and this kind of emphatic nationalism that's much more conservative, I guess specifically in the Algerian case, because that's where I know it better, where do you see sort of internal tensions playing out in terms of like ethnicity? I thought it was interesting that you mentioned sort of Kabylia in the 1960s, and obviously the comebacks again in the 80s and 90s. Where does these sort of sub-national or kind of regional tensions play out in this framework?
So one of the things that I was gesturing to, although I didn't have time to say much about it, in terms of thinking about the revolution in Algeria, much less as a kind of exemplar of cosmopolitan third worldist openness, is precisely the way in which Algerian nationalist politics themselves are tremendously, awful, Machiavellian, complicated, really Byzantine, really hard to write about, and structured by a whole lot of very complicated internal fissures and dynamics, right? And that's often reduced in a lot of literature to a kind of pre-existing ethnic struggle, Arabs versus Berbers, right? That's nonsense. And that's not what's happening. Or even Arabs versus Kabyles, right? So there's a very important way in which a set of ideas about Algerian culture develops from the 1920s onwards, especially among Kabyle diaspora workers in Paris who are overrepresented, right, in the labour force in France for particular reasons having to do with Kabylia being a very mountainous region, which is very heavily overpopulated and exports its labour, right? So there are more Kabyles in France than elsewhere. They get socialised earlier. They're overrepresented in the nationalist movement for those reasons. And some of their positions come to be seen within the Algerian nationalist movement as Kabyle positions, as Berberist positions. Nobody ever says they're a Berberist. I mean, not until the 1980s. Berberiste is an accusation. Berbero-matérialiste, right, is the label that's stuck on them by their enemies. But like most political labels, it's an anathema that's invented by people who are opposed to them. But there are these tensions about, the place of pre-Islamic culture in a future Algerian national identity, right? The place of linguistic pluralism in Algeria. Should it be possible? Should Tamazight, Berber languages, Berber dialects be kind of fully part of the national patrimony, or are they somehow kind of secondary, archaic throwbacks that need to be replaced by a modern standard Arabic, which is going to allow universal education? So weirdly, some of those sub-national, regional political tensions play out in ways that identify the proponents of those what come to be seen as regionalist tendencies as more cosmopolitan than the other guys, right? So it's the Kabyles who are kind of more open, cosmopolitan, if you like, leftist, than the people who are opposed to them. The proponents of a kind of more plural conception of Algerian nationalism are also open to a more plural, kind of cosmopolitan, wider emancipatory sense of what it's going to be, what's going to mean to be an independent nation. And they generally lose, right? They're the guys who generally lose out. And certainly in 63 to 65, there are people who get militarily repressed. I mean, by in Kabylia, people talked about the war against the French and then the war against the Arabs. The war against the French was one, and then there was the war against quote-unquote the Arabs, which means the people from like down the mountain. But the FLN was an army of occupation, was experienced as an army of occupation in parts of Kabylia, which had paradoxically been one of the strongest, regions for the implementation of the FLN during the war, because it's very mountainous and very difficult to access, and the French had a hard time pacifying it, quote unquote. So that's a very long-winded way around saying that it doesn't work out the way you think it probably will. I think that a lot of these kind of sub-national tensions within the Algerian case, at least, actually align with a greater sense of openness and the more kind of cosmopolitan, internationalist, Fanonian sort of vision of things. And people who see themselves as being, the majority view, constituting a kind of majoritarian idea of national community, which is kind of exclusively Arab or Islamic, there are no Berbers in North Africa. There's nobody who's not an Arab, and Arabic is the language that everybody should really speak. And Islam, the way that we say it should be practiced, and not the way they say it should be practiced out in the villages where they're ignorant and superstitious, is everybody's Islam. Those people are the kind of more the narrower.
Yeah, so I guess I have to film. So my question would be, so you say that between 1962 and 1965, Ben Bella was the face of the revolution. In a sense, from 1967 on, the face of the revolution was the Battle of Algiers, the film.
Yeah.
And in your, and I think that film is a film that really portrays the revolution as a force without strong conflicts. I mean, you really have to look carefully to see the conflicts in the FLN if you only look at the film. Yeah. The film really shows this sort of progressive force. So what you were saying, I think one of the ways, one of the reasons why we see that revolution in this sort of monolithic way might be the film itself.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's true. Fanon was for export and Anticolonialism was for export too. And that's kind of obvious and makes a lot of sense. And the film that Anticolonialism made was, as you know, based on one guy's narrative of what had happened. I mean, there was not just anybody's narrative. I mean, Saadi Yassef, who was the commander of the operational commander of the FLN guerrilla organization in Algeria, basically wrote the movie on the basis of the memoirs that he wrote, right? And his relationship with Anticolonialism was complicated, and there were all kinds of interesting things to be said about that. But that narrative was also very heavily contested, right, within Algeria immediately after the revolution. Saadi Yassef was considered by many people to be a very dubious character himself. Had he done a deal, why did he survive when everybody else who got arrested around the same time got murdered? Did he do some kind of deal with the French? I mean, these were all the stories that were circulating, right? So, yes, I mean, the face of the film internationally, especially because the French banned it, and because it came out at it came out when it came out, right? I mean, it came out right before '68. There's a receptivity on the international stage to this particular vision of what Algeria stood for, and that was right around the time that the Boumediene regime itself was actually very hesitant to project any kind of public image. Boumediene himself, unlike Ben Bella, was very uncomfortable in public. Right? He wasn't seen in public very much for the first couple of years. They didn't start using TV as a way of broadcasting Boumediene's own image until a little bit later. So the film, I mean, and it's a great movie, right? I mean, it filled a particular vacuum, right, in the international presentation of the revolution at a time when a lot of people who'd previously, around the time of the events being portrayed, had been very supportive of the revolution, thought of themselves as having been betrayed by what had just happened, right? Because they thought of Ben Bella's regime as the thing they supported, and a lot of people were predisposed to buy the argument about the Boumediene coup as a kind of whitist confiscation of the revolution. Right? So the Anticolonialism film kind of wiped all that out of people's consciousness, I think, to a large extent.
Thank you for a really very stimulating talk. And this question follows up a little bit on yours. It's really about sort of memory, official or contested. I mean, has the memory of the revolution been very curated by these different regimes in Algeria? And has the sort of modern media revolution also meant that you can't control anyway memories of the revolution? And I'm thinking both of schools, but even museum, the history museum. Is there an attempt to present a single view, like the movie, but one for internal consumption?
Yeah. So there's, especially from the 70s onwards, there's a need to narrativize the revolution, and that happens in some very monolithic way, as you would expect. And maybe especially from the early 1980s, right? Especially from the early 1980s, this generational shift really begins to kick in. And also as they begin the Arabization of the school system, which really starts in the early 1980s in a big way. And new school manuals are being written and so on. And crucially, after 1978 and the death of Boumediene, when the regime is beginning to lose a little bit of its luster, right, in the early 80s. So that's when they begin to invest in these really big kind of monumentalizing projects. They planned them before, but they don't actually get around to building them until the 1980s. So the famous Maqam Shahid, right, the monument to the martyr, which completely dominates the skyline in Algiers, this great monument of 3 palm fronds with the statues of the martyrs at the base. And that whole complex, which is probably a shopping complex and illustrative of other changes taking place at the same time. But also that there's a monument, a museum, right, of the revolution in that as part of the same complex, which is right across the way from the Museum of the Army. And it's all, and it's still there. I mean, it's pretty uninspiring now, right? And I think it was always probably pretty uninspiring to most people. And in fact, in the early 80s, that was explicitly the target of attack for the Islamists, right? They called it Hubal. They called it the name of a pre-Islamic Meccan idol destroyed by the Prophet. So it was an example of human what's the word, pretensions to And it was built right next to a shantytown, which was a very poor area, and they were spending millions of dollars with this Canadian company building this enormous great thing, and people next door were living in poverty, right? So what was that all about? So the way that the memory was curated was pretty blunt and clumsy, I mean, in short. And that's not to say that it wasn't an enormously powerful narrative, right? As a kind of unanimous, uniting, as you said before, right? The narrative in which nonetheless everybody could commune, literally. And that all kind of broke apart, I think, in the late 80s. Now, as I said, one of the things that the Islamists are doing is recuperating bits of the narrative, but they're also reacting against it, and that's happening at the same time. More recently, this is something that I've worked on properly, but the kind of fragmentation of the public sphere in the 1990s and the kind of the blowing apart of the whole unanimous edifice of the single-party state, it's happened in the late 80s and early 90s, did, I think, give rise to a kind of opening up of spaces in social memory, right, to create new kinds of narrative like that. And we get many more, regional, personal narratives. It became possible to write autobiographies, right, which hadn't been okay before, and it suddenly became okay. And that hasn't yet gone as far as what I was saying before, in terms of kind of new narratives people can kind of inhabit in more creative ways that might kind of put the nation back together again in a more effective kind of way that might survive the end of the British generation. But it has kind of happened. Yeah.
We probably have time for one more question. Anyone has a question on the next one?
So you talked some about sort of the revolutionary struggle and the transnational nature of the transnational operation. I kind of wanted to ask you about sort of the transnational nature of counter-revolution.
Yeah.
Particularly in sort of the current context, with Sisi, the U.S.'s aid to Sisi's government, the arms deals between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to sort of subsidize its atrocities in Yemen. Even like Egypt and Israel, closing the border, physically limiting the ability of Gaza for Palestinians to actually travel transnationally, right? So I just wanted to.
Yeah, so absolutely, and arguably, what's the problem here? The problem maybe has always been that counter-revolution has always been much more transnationally effective than revolution has. Ever since 1848, or before then, the war, the first coalition against the French Revolution. The counter-revolution has always been very fundamentally effective, and the extent to which that, maybe that's easier to grasp, right? In terms of some older narratives, the extent to which counter-revolutionary movements for the preservation of inegalitarian distributions of power and resources and mobility and racial privilege and everything else mobilize a network of interests that are connected by international capital is not very surprising. So, that's why it's hard to do the other thing.
Right, well, let's thank Professor McDougall for a great talk.